turn it over to Christopher Gordon and to Elyssa Ford for this upcoming presentation.
Well, I'm not going to take any more of Alyssa's time, so go right ahead, and we're all really looking forward to hearing this.
Yeah, hi again. Sorry, y'all. Apparently we had the wrong link and didn't know we had the wrong link. So I will try to jump in since I probably otherwise had at least 30 minutes worth of stuff to do. My name is Elyssa Ford, and I'll be kind of like looking off to the side because my full screen that y'all can see, which you're seeing my full PowerPoint screen now. Does that sound good? Excellent. So I'll be looking off there because that's where that is. So I'm an associate professor of history at Northwest Missouri State University, and we have a minor at the undergraduate level in public history and museum studies. And so today I'll be talking about planning museum exhibits on difficult history topics. And so thought I'd just kind of review what the goals of the session were, which you've all seen before because that was in the abstract. So we're going to be looking at how museums can approach like more difficult or hidden histories in their own communities, and often they are hidden because they are difficult and controversial and we don't want to talk about them, or we don't feel comfortable talking about them, or we think it's going to make someone mad. And so the kind of framework around this that I found really useful, and I think my class found really useful, was using a book published in 2016 by Julia Rose called Interpreting Difficult History at Museums and Historic Sites. And I'll pull this up again. This is a really fantastic book. It's part of a series, and the series is the Interpreting Whatever History at Museums and Historic Sites. It's published by Rowman and Littlefield. So for instance, here's an Interpreting Slavery at Museums and Historic Sites. There's Interpreting Military History, Interpreting Maritime History, Sports History. There's a whole array of them. I would say that some are better than others. So if you have a chance to look at them, or at least look at the table of contents before you purchase them, I think that would be a good idea. And when I mean better than others, I mean what they're kind of doing. So like the slavery and difficult history books are both really talking about like kind of approaches, how you can approach this, good examples, problematic examples, and really grappling with that like interpretation component. Some of the other ones, like the military history book, really talks very little about interpreting or museum exhibits, and it's mostly like chapters that provide short summaries or overviews about the different like wars that the US has been involved in. And also, if anything changes in here and you cannot see are you seeing my full PowerPoint screen? I just had a little thing that popped up that seemed a little bit weird. Or are you seeing my presenter view?
We're seeing your full screen, not the presenter view.
Okay, thank you. I just had a strange note that I've never seen before. Okay, so in doing this, hopefully we'll ease some of the concerns that you may have if you work at a museum or another type of institution, and potential concerns that your stakeholders may have or your board may have in approaching topics like this. And we'll also provide some of a kind of a model for visitor learning to help guide visitors through what you're talking about. And then I'll be looking at this specifically with some exhibits that my undergrad students at Northwest created for the Nottoway County Historical Society, which is our local museum here in Maryville. So in addition to doing exhibits, they also created websites and lesson plans. So what is difficult history? So I would like everyone to just take maybe 30 seconds. We won't take more than that because we're running short on time. And I want you to think about like, what is difficult history? What does that mean to you? And then what would be a difficult history topic or topics for your museum, your site, or your institution? And just like jot down a few of the things that are maybe the topics that you're a little nervous to tackle, you think would be hard to tackle, you don't want to tackle for some reason. Oh yeah, and feel free, Roro just put something in the chat. That's a great idea. Go ahead and put some things in the chat, what you can think of that would be important topics for you to talk about and include, but you haven't yet, and you're just kind of concerned about it. That's a great place to put this. And I think all of us are probably coming up with things that we think are difficult. And maybe they're things we already do, but we know they're difficult to talk about. And maybe there's certain things we don't want to end up saying about them. So keep adding stuff in there as we're moving through, because I think as I talk about some of the things that we've done, it's probably going to spark some things in your mind too about topics that you could have that you haven't quite tackled or aren't quite sure how to tackle. Yeah, Angela, great point, right? The topics that some people wouldn't want presented, or viewpoints that they don't want presented. And Dana, we're going to get to something really similar to rape and sexual assault is something that we've done. Okay, so a little bit about this project. So I already said I teach at Northwest, but I also am the president of the Historical Society. Though I was not the president when we were doing this, I was on the board. So I'm involved in the Historical Society as well. The Nottoway County Historical Society is a small museum. We have one part-time staff member. Everything else is entirely visitor run. And as you can tell from these screenshots, snips from our website, we have pretty like standard exhibits, right? Like standard safe exhibits, women in Nottoway County, agriculture, community celebrations, eating local. It's just kind of fun things that we want to remember, right? The things that maybe we're proud of and excited about our community. But we also have a lot of stuff that like people don't want to talk about and that we're also not proud of. And the museum has often not talked about those topics. And so I had been thinking for a number of years that I wanted to do more with some of those topics at the Historical Society and or on campus, but like community topics. And so over a 2-year process, this was really a 2-year process coming to fruition, and worked on in 2 different courses to kind of develop these exhibits. So the first time that I tried this out was in the fall of 2019 in my public history class. This is an undergraduate level class made up of anywhere from sophomores to seniors, mostly history majors, though not always. And in that class, I thought, well, I was thinking maybe we can just do like a little sort of pop-up exhibit, right? And we can make it kind of this tight little piece that we'll be doing in class after we do like a little bit about museums, a little bit about exhibits, and then this is sort of the hands-on grappling with kind of difficult topics. And so we did a little pre-reading on, as you can see, they're salacious exhibits. So we read this piece that you see in the bottom right called the Finger Saga, which is a museum in Ohio that has a set of fingers that are pickled in a jar. And these are fingers that a husband cut off using a hatchet of his wife's hand, and he killed her. So this was a domestic assault that ended in death, and somehow the museum has her fingers and they display them in a jar, and it's what the museum is known for. Everyone wants to come and see the creepy fingers. And probably a number of our museums have some similar things. Sometimes we may display them and sometimes we may not display them, but we know we still have them. And so this piece was talking about like, well, how do we have this thing that's just like the bazaar, and how do we make it into like an actual conversation about like domestic assault and violence? And so I wanted the class to try to work on this with some different murders in Nottoway County. So as you can see from our snippet of our course schedule, we had 2 days in class where we were kind of doing this reading and then getting into the material. And then a couple of days where they were actually working on the exhibit. I thought, okay, 3 days, it'll be enough to get to something. We got to nowhere. It was not nearly enough time. The results were not enough time for this project at all. It was far too much to grapple with like a day just trying to do the theory, plus some of this like exhibit makeovers book, this is a really fantastic book if you're looking for a way to sort of guide yourself doing exhibit makeovers on a shoestring. Strongly recommend. And the students really needed more guidance. instead of just me throwing some newspaper articles at them and saying, well, you've read this one theoretical piece, like you're good to go and do the thing. They needed more. And so I still wanted to do this, but instead I decided to frame an entire class around it. So the following fall, 2020, my local history practicum class, which is also at the undergraduate level, I had the entire class focused on doing difficult history and preparing these difficult history exhibits. In selecting the topics, I didn't leave it open. I actually had pre-identified 5 different topics. And then the students really self-selected and self-sorted into the ones that they were the most interested in working on. And so what we did were kind of 2 broad categories, often ignored groups. So the museum has very little in it on slavery or on Native Americans. And then 3 really controversial killings that have happened in Nottoway County. Dr. Talbot in 1881, whose sons end up being executed. And that's really the more controversial part, than Dr. Talbot being killed. Raymond Gunn in 1931, who was a Black man who was accused of raping and killing a white school teacher and was taken from jail and lynched here in town. And then Ken Rex McElroy, who some people maybe have heard of since there are BuzzFeed videos and a new documentary and all sorts of things on Ken Rex McElroy, who was kind of a vigilante style killing sort of by the town of Skidmore in the county in 1981. And these are topics that are difficult to discuss. People don't want to discuss, and for some of them, there are people still alive who remember them or were involved in them. So there's a lot of reasons why the museum has been really touchy about them. So what did we end up doing? We spent a lot more time framing this topic and framing difficult history, and I would really strongly recommend that you do that in your own site as well. Don't just jump into the topic itself. You really need to step back and do some thinking about difficult history, framing it, what can be the pitfalls, because then that's going to help you understand how you want to approach your topic, okay? So we started a little bit with some local, like what is local history and how to do it? What is a museum and what should it do? How does a museum function? How should a museum function? How is it disseminating information? How should it disseminate information? Can a museum change its approach? I think this one is really great. History that promotes understanding a diverse society, right? If you have like one specific type of visitor and your visitor is not really reflective of like the diversity in the community around you, that may have to do with the stories you're telling, and probably more importantly, the stories you're not telling and how you're telling them. And so this provides some guidance there. We also did a small feature on difficult history focused on exhibiting 9/11 and looked a little bit, this second piece right here is really good in showcasing how 2 different museums approached 9/11 very soon after 9/11 happened, and the receptions of communities. So this was sort of like this scratching the surface for students and getting to see how communities could react to topics and to messages that they may not be happy seeing, okay? And then we're diving into the Julia Rose piece, which I'll get to. In terms of exhibit design, this is what that looked like. This can kind of give you a sense as well if you're at a site and you're not teaching, but how could you do this and like what kind of time frame would this look like? And this was over the course of like a 3.5 month semester. Probably working on it for 6 to 10 hours a week. So we did intro to exhibits in 1 day, label making over 3 weeks, website making for 2 weeks, lesson plan design and making for 2 weeks, and then exhibit production and installation took 2 weeks. Okay, so for the Julia Rose piece, this is a book that is a little bit complicated and heavy theoretical. We only did 1 chapter a day and really broke it down. And I would really recommend that if you use this book, which I very much recommend, that you do the same. Do not try to read it all at once. It's going to feel pretty overwhelming. I'd maybe have you or a couple people creating a little committee that are going to sit together and read a chapter like each day or each week so that you're going through and talking about this and breaking it down. And I've got a series of like discussion questions and PowerPoints and about this reading that might help. And I'm more than happy to share that with you if you'd like me to. So in a nutshell, here are some of the key things that Rose talks about. So she talks a lot about like making your people multidimensional. A lot of times these people who we're not considering, right? And if it's maybe Native American communities, enslaved communities, separate other indigenous immigrant communities, they often are the other, right? And they're one-dimensional entities. So how do we make them these multidimensional people who become the center of the story? This can be it's really common to do this when we're talking about slavery, because we've got kind of slavery and enslaved peoples, and we're often not highlighting or really thinking about how to make enslaved peoples individuals, right? That like I can connect to as a visitor. And so her terminology is like, how do we make them the face, not the other? How do we make them the face, not a face in the crowd? How do we make it someone that people can connect to? And then they're going to care and be invested in that story as the visitor. Similarly, how do you make your topic real? And so what she means by this is think about what story you're telling and how you were telling it. Why does it need to be told now? Who are you telling the story to? How does it relate to today? What is the purpose of telling the story? Because if you're just telling it because, then you probably aren't that invested in making this like a real story. You don't have a reason. So what is your reason? Why do you think the Nottoway County Historical Society needs to tell the history of Native Americans, right? So what are you doing this for? Who is your audience? And what do you want the results to be? So some of this is kind of thinking about your site as a bit of an activist, right? How can your site be involved in kind of social justice and like kind of this activist site where you're doing something for a purpose, not just presenting like the status quo? And then she's got these 9 storytelling components. And I've got this actually as a PDF saved that I'm gonna go ahead and pop. Oh, it's not showing up. Let me see. I've got this saved as a PDF that I will, well, it's not letting me choose something from my desktop anymore. So I'm not sure how to share it, but if you want it, I've got my email at the end and I can share a PDF of this because I know there's a lot of those different storytelling components there. But in this, these are the especially key parts in thinking about how to frame uncomfortable stories for your audience members. So is that going to be uncomfortable in terms of, like the person in the chat said, well, how you talk about rape, like that's uncomfortable. People don't want to talk about it. Is it telling a different version? I think Raylene, you'd said like Pearl Harbor, right? If we're going to talk about or Japanese internment, how are we going to, or the dropping of the atomic bombs? If I'm telling a version of that that's going to make people uncomfortable than like what they have known, that's where they're going to get angry or upset, or they're going to push back. And so some of these storytelling components from Rose are really important in helping you as the museum figure out like how they may be reacting and to kind of counter some of that reaction. So for instance, the third one, set a purposeful tone and embrace tensions to show that history matters. Here's why I'm doing this. Here is why this matters. Allow for discussion. Be respectful and sensitive to visitors' experience. So create some space around it. Don't just be confrontational with it. Understand that you are creating something that may be difficult for people to understand and engage with. And sometimes that difficulty may be, I'm having this presentation of information that's about the lynching of a Black man in the 1930s. That may not just be difficult for white people from Nottoway County to see and interact with, because that's something they want to push under the rug and forget about. It may also be difficult for Black visitors to see, because it's this continued presentation of trauma and really hard stuff. So difficult history can be difficult in various ways for multiple groups of people. And then the other key element of her book is talking about this commemorative museum pedagogy, for which she has 5 key elements that you see on the screen. So first, recognizing that something is difficult history, right? You've got to, once you recognize that, then you can know better how to approach it. Second, understanding of the 5 R's, which are included in the book, so I won't get into them. use of the 3 building blocks, which is that face, the real, and then the narrative, the story that goes with it. How do you make this a real story? 4th, provide a safe and respectful environment that allows for learning, dialogue, supportive resources, so people have that time to grapple with this thing that's making them uncomfortable. And then finally, and this is kind of most importantly, you have to have an institution that is committed to telling this history. If you're volunteers, if you rely on volunteers to take people through the museum and they are not on board with the version of the Raymond Gunn lynching that you are putting forward, then everything you have done in that display is not actually going to be disseminated really to visitors. So how can you have these conversations, not with just you as the person creating that exhibit, but how can you get your volunteers and your staff and them on board? Because if you don't have them on board, you're never going to get the visitors on board. Okay, so in a few minutes, I thought I'd just run through and show you a few of the things, and I'll point out a few key components here. So putting it together, in creating, these are both samples of sample exhibit panels. These are from the one on Native Americans. So one of the things that the group doing Native American history wanted to be really careful to do was, one, to show something different than the museum often shows. The museum often shows a more friendly relationship that Native peoples willingly gave their land and were so thankful for this opportunity to white settlers, and that's not what happened. And so they very clearly say something different, that yes, there was a treaty that was signed, but in doing so, they lost vast amounts of money and they lost their land. They also wanted to be really clear about showing that the Native American presence in Northwestern Missouri is not just a thing of the past, but that there are indigenous peoples who are still here today. They are buried, they are involved, and they are proud. So they wanted to include that instead of showing just this kind of gone people. Here you can see the exhibits. Because of COVID and the museum was closed at the time, we actually installed them on campus first, and then have since moved several of them over to the Historical Society. So you can kind of see an outline, see some different, each case is a separate exhibit. You get a little bit of a sense of what they looked like. For the websites, this was on the website, a lot of the material was the same that was presented in the displays, but they also were able to, and you of course are able to include additional information. I've included the URL here. If you want to see what any of these look like, I'll include that link in the chat really fast. If you scroll down, it'll see all of the different kind of websites that the museum has for companion exhibits. And then down towards the bottom, you'll see kind of killings or murders, African American history, and Native American history. But for some of these, they really worked on taking some different approaches. So for the Raymond Gunn case, it's really complicated I mean, this was a lynching of a Black man in a really horrific way with a very kind of common reasoning that he raped and killed this white woman. We never, did he or didn't he? There was never a trial that happened. Trials were often very kind of biased in that time anyway. And so it was kind of figuring out how the balance between talking about the woman who was killed and also the way in which Gunn was killed. And one of the things this group did was talk a lot about the role of the media and how in comparing media presentations in Nottoway County, in St. Joe, in Kansas City, and other parts of the country, what that looked like and how the media presentation of the case actually sort of whipped stuff up into a frenzy. So that was kind of an interesting approach on how to address a more complicated topic. A lot of these websites are really great for providing additional resources, because if you get into this, you may want to know more. These are complicated topics. So sometimes it's through secondary sources that you see here. The one on Raymond Gunn also includes links to the NAACP and the Equal Justice Initiative. It was also using an opportunity to present census reports, slave narratives, a whole array of other materials. The one on Doc Talbot is particularly interesting because the thing that they really centered their exhibit about was domestic violence. When Doc Talbot was killed, he was a very esteemed member of the community in the 1880s. 1870s and 1880s. And when he was killed, it came out that he was actually very physically abusive to his wife and to his children. And so something they talked about in this was domestic abuse and kind of that kind of victim system, and when the abuser ends up being killed, kind of who is at fault, who is blamed for that. And they have a lot of information about kind of lasting impact and resources for domestic abuse. So really seeing a little bit more of like that activist approach there, instead of just keeping this as a thing that happened in the 1880s, but like domestic violence still happens. And here's how we can think about that and talk about that. The lesson plans were particularly complicated for some of the groups. They had to do elementary, middle school, and high school lesson plans. And so it was, how do you make a elementary school lesson plan dealing with lynching? It's hard. And so we've got a series of links here that talk about how to teach hard history. Kids are a lot more resilient than you think they may be and are able to kind of comprehend complex topics. And you have some excerpts here where you can see a little bit about like the approaches that were taken at various levels. So in the Talbot murder, this one's at the middle school level and wasn't talking about domestic violence, but instead was looking at the trial itself was full of rumors and had very little evidence. It's unclear what happened during the trial and the crime itself. What conclusions can we draw from the information that we have? And so your learning objectives are tied to the justice system and like, how do we determine opinion and fact? So really looking at kind of tangential ways to teach this like very local history material, but in a way that could be used in St. Louis or in Kansas City or in Wichita. Like it's still relevant, even if you're talking about Maryville history. So key takeaways. Tackling hard, controversial, uncomfortable history, it is possible. It doesn't have to be as difficult as you may imagine it to be. However, do think carefully about your topics and about your approach first. And I think really framing it with these like theoretical discussions and these examples like in your brain are going to help you do that instead of just diving into the topic. Some visitors may be uncomfortable. That is a reality, right? My view and my argument of that fact is that it is okay, but you can prepare for it. It doesn't mean you can keep it from happening, but you can prepare for it, and you can also help them kind of work through that discomfort. And second, I also believe that museums have an ethical responsibility to tell these stories, whether or not some visitors are going to be uncomfortable with them. So if you have any questions, you got my email address right there. E as in elephant, B as in Buffalo, Ford like the car, ebford@nwmissouri.edu. And I'm sorry, we would have had 10 minutes for discussion, but now we're out of time. But I can stay around a little longer if people do have questions. And I can stop the share so y'all can see each other some, not that most people have their videos on. Are there any questions? If you need to leave, of course, you're welcome to do so.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think we have a few minutes for a question, so please go ahead and ask if you have a question.
And I'll look again in this chat to see if I can include that. No, the chat isn't letting me for some reason. I tried it before and it did, but this is not. Yeah, you're welcome, Dana. I cannot stress enough. This book is fantastic. Highly, highly recommend.
Hello? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
So I'm here with Danny too. We were wondering, how would you go about, and I know you were really talking about it, but how would you go about discussing some of the topic of the Holocaust or anything with children who are not emotionally ready to handle, like you don't want to take away, their quote unquote, their innocence of the world, too young, you still want them to live their life, and how would you go about introducing like the Holocaust or something to an elementary student?
Yeah, so first of all, I think the Interpreting Slavery at Museums and Historic Sites is a fantastic book. I really would recommend looking at that, and then the ideas from it can be used for other topics too. The other thing, the screen that I had that said teaching hard history, a lot of those links talk about this and talk especially about how to do this at the elementary school level, because a lot of like elementary school teachers will say exactly that, right? How do I teach this at the elementary school level? Like this is hard, this is uncomfortable, like they're not going to be able to understand it. And what's kind of amazing is that as young as like second and third graders, they actually can understand it. They can have some incredibly complex conversations about slavery and about the Holocaust. I also think that there's a value to talking about that, because you also had children who were enslaved and you had children who were killed purposefully in the Holocaust. I mean, this is something that was done to kids. And I think that's a story that's a way to like help kids connect with it too, to be like, oh, it's not just those other people, like this was also done to like, to me in this sense. And they're able to see that.
All right.
Hope that helps some. So Phil's got a question in the chat. How can BIPOC individuals challenge organizations that are built on traditionally white cis hetero foundations? Often I feel like many people of color and other marginalized individuals feel powerless when trying to open up these uncomfortable topics. Phil, do you mean like as someone who, like as people who are working in those institutions and want to see the institutions change, or as like audience members that would like to see the space? It could be both of those. Yeah, okay. I honestly feel like it's more difficult sometimes if you're within the organization, because I feel like when you work within that organization, you feel like your job, right, could be at risk if you're pushing back against a system that does not want to do that. To me, at least, I feel like that makes it more uncomfortable. But I think if you can maybe encourage the museum to be going to conferences, to things like MAMA, to the National Council on Public History, to the American Alliance on Museums, to the AASLH, American Association of State and Local History, because all of those organizations are having these conversations and how to present this material, and that this material needs to be presented. So if you have people who are resistant to those messages and they're going to these conferences or participating in the webinars, then they're being maybe exposed to that idea, not just coming from you as that individual within that institution. I also think that at your own institution, if you provide a way for visitors to give feedback, what would you like to see this museum talk about? What do you not see here? What stories would you like to be included? You've got that opportunity for visitors to very easily provide feedback on things they would like to see that you may not even realize you're not including. Yeah, and Dana's got a great idea there too, right? Show how other museums are presenting this topic.
Hello. You brought up earlier about like these topic about like murders in your class, and how would you, like, difficult history has some very strong emotions, and I feel like sometimes exhibits can't properly express the emotions that might be behind some of these actions. Do you know any ideas on how that could be shown?
So how to show the emotion. I think so. One of the things this in Julia Rose's piece, when she's talking about like how to make the story real, right? Creating that narrative and making it real. One of the things that she talks about it there is think like, do you have objects? Do you have photographs? Is there something that's more than just the word on the page that you can include? Because that's a way to help people connect to it. But then she also acknowledges like a lot of times you don't have those things. So what do you do when you really don't have the stuff to help people connect to it? I don't think she's got like 100% answers on that. Maybe it's trying to find a way to include some of the voices of people. When we talk about the slavery exhibit that group did, they really wanted to make, there's a slave narrative, one of the WPA 1930s slave narratives that was done with a woman who was enslaved in Nottoway County. And we have a photograph of her. And so they wanted to make her the face, right? Like, here is a woman who was enslaved. Here are her stories. Here is what happened to her. If we look on this map, here is where she was enslaved. So as a way to pull out some of those stories, find the thing that people can connect to, and then you're able to try to get to some of that emotion, right? I can now see her as a person. Of course, Rose also talks about a lot of these things, like if we're talking about domestic violence and assault, that can elicit a lot of emotions among visitors. And so she talks about providing that space for visitors to sit and to think about that topic as well, so they can also deal with their own kind of emotional reaction to what's happening.
Dr. Ford, thank you so much. I'm afraid we're out of time. It's 5 till, so we do have to go, but this has been a great presentation. I think everyone's learned a lot, and certainly should check out these additional resources. So thank you for presenting today.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, feel free to email me if you'd like a copy of my PowerPoint. I'm more than happy to share that with anyone. So thank you, and have a great wrapping up of the conference.
Thank you to everyone.